moving on. Panel number 1 is why we honor the primal continuum of human development and reclaiming ancient wisdom and intuitive knowing and integrating this knowledge within the new sciences, biological principles. Our moderators are Dave Paxson and Sandra Beardsley. Sandra is the president of APA, the Association for I know the acronym, and I'll say that so often, and it's a mouthful. And here it is, the president of the Association of Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology, and she's a health midwife, L&D nurse, doula, lactation consultant, birth and parenting educator, and counselor. Every single person in this room has a list of skills that they offer, so we welcome Sandra. And also Dave Paxson, who is a clinical social worker, epidemiologist, and craniosacral therapist. He is the president of the Craniosacral Therapist Association, academic background in economics, evolutionary biology, and anthropology, and is active in the Association for Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health. So with further ado, I pass the microphone over to you, Sandra. Thank you.
Well, we're very, very happy to be here. Birthkeeper is an absolutely wonderful aspect of this work. And Birthkeeper is a coalition of many different organizations that are working on the development of the primal continuum. And so it's a very exciting thing that APA has been asked to be a part of at least starting this. I've asked Dave to actually start off first by explaining to you a little bit about the whole continuum aspect. So Dave?
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to bring a little bit of personal into this, and I hope everyone does on this panel and all the others. I encourage you to do so. The main reason I'm here is, and the main reason I'm a Birthkeeper, I'm one of the founders of the Birthkeeper core board that's now only 2.5 years old, is I think the most important thing you can do in service is to improve the experience of birth, the experience of incarnation, and the experience of as a child. And we talk about this primal continuum, which for us starts actually at preconception. And in Birthkeeper, we have some basic tenets that we want to see more conscious conception, more conscious parenting, more conscious birthing, and more conscious parenting, which tends to suggest that a lot of what we do in those areas in our culture this day is unconscious. And I don't think I'll get much argument in that in this room. Anyway, I know I've met a lot of women who get interested in this field because they've had children and they were unhappy with their experience giving childbirth. There were things about the experience that they did not like. And that was their motivation to get involved in all this. I will tell you, I was very unhappy with my experience of being born. I know a lot about it. My mother was an obstetrics nurse herself, kept meticulous records. And so the way I look at it is it's my duty to be sure that people who are born today are not born under the conditions that I was born. And I'll get to that in a second as to what are those conditions. Highly intervened, highly technical. And then I was born in 1949. As we went through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it got even more and more interventionist and technical. But to start at the beginning, for human beings, birth is somewhat problematical in that when we started walking upright, the pelvis tended to decrease in size, and at the same time, our brains were getting bigger. So there became this sort of friction or contest between the size of the head and the size of the pelvis that the head goes through when it's being born. But through tens and maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, that process has evolved. Different than most other animals, and different than most other mammals in the way that it's done. And that evolution, and if you have to believe in evolution to understand that evolution, I first want to give credit to a woman who devoted her life to understanding the evolution of human birth. Her name is Wenda Trevathan, Trevathan. She taught as an anthropologist at the University of New Mexico. She was published in Scientific American twice about the evolution of human birth and what the implications of the evolution of human birth were for how practices should be in maternity care. So I think of all the things that happened to me when I was born, and I say, boy, were they really necessary? Did they traumatize me? Birth is a dramatic event enough as it is, and then certain other things happen to it. But personally, you know, my mother and I got ether. The cord was cut right away. I was separated from my mother right away. I only breastfed for a couple of days. I was circumcised within a day. I think I was probably held upside down and smacked on the bottom. It goes back that far. But as a birth keeper, now I've spent most of my life clinical social work. Even I've done birth process work with people like Ray Castellino and Myrna Martin. There's sort of an element there of healing, helping people to heal any trauma that they may have from their experience of birth. And as I've gotten older, I've realized, you know, that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's probably more like an ounce is worth a couple of tons of cure. And I'm shifting away from, you know, being a therapist who helps people deal with, I still like to do some of that and support people with when they get activated, when they get in touch with it, which may happen to some of you today. Don't be afraid if it happens. It's a good sign, I believe, that the system is saying you can now become more aware of these types of things. But there's just not enough being done in terms of preventing these things from being done in the first place, that then people deal with all their lives. The obstetricians are right up the street meeting for the next couple of days. The vast majority of them are oblivious to the fact that they're excessive intervention. Okay. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm giving you the general thing. I'm unhappy, and the coming panelists are going to talk about things that happen that shouldn't happen, but they're also going to talk about ways that birth can be more even ideal, or certainly more nurturing, or whatever. So birth evolved, and then starting in the 20th century, we came to this position where there was less midwifery, more obstetrics, the medical system, which developed in the late 19th century, early 20th. And I'm going to leave it at that and have these four folks talk about that. Starting, and I would like her to introduce herself. I talked to her myself a couple days ago at length, and it was a marvelous conversation. And she has a lot to offer. This is Julie Bonipace from Ottawa, Canada. And Julie, would you introduce yourself from that point on, please?
Sure. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. Lots of gratitude. I guess you could describe me as being an intense person. That's a very difficult question to say who I am, but I'm very intense. I work in many different countries. I speak different languages, and I train midwives and physicians and nurses all over the world. My passion, I have two passions. My first is, I think, extreme sports, and through extreme sports, rock climbing and skydiving and kite surfing and a whole bunch of stuff, I've learned to master sensations, very strong sensations. So I think that's what I bring to the birthing world, is the trust that we have in our body, in our spirits, in our capacities to tap into our inner resources. The other thing that I bring to the table, I think, is my work as a family mediator. So I used to negotiate divorces for the Ministry of Justice in Quebec. And in practicing this work, I came to understand that the birth of a child was often a source of conflict in a couple and was at the center of the difficulties that couples were experiencing. So my work is centered around preparing parents and including the father, the dads, so that they can play an active role during pregnancy and childbirth. And so they can be more active after birth. So what I want to talk about today is essentially this whole notion about pain and how much emphasis we're putting on pain and on inabilities that women have to manage pain. And the first thing I'd like to tell you is I've also worked in a lab, pain management, a non-pharma pain management lab. And the cause of nociception, you know, the origins of pain in labor are not clear at all, because actually when you give birth, you have no lesions per se. You know, when the cervix dilates, when the muscles are contracted, or when they're stretched, there are no lesions. So I'm really questioning all of this notion of pain. And I'd like to tell you maybe a little bit of a story. In 1877, Engelmann, an obstetrician, an American obstetrician, started questioning all of the routines that we did in birth. For example, having women lay down to give birth. And he said, well, I'm going to check the North American indigenous people and people who let themselves be governed by their instinct and see how they give birth. And he noticed that women gave birth standing and sitting and squatting and lying on their side and on their stomach even, but no women gave birth lying on their back. And he said, well, you know, I believe that that's a tradition, that's something that we invented. And we kind of know that it was somewhere in the 1700s that a French obstetrician or physician thought it would be easier for them to have the women lay down, and even though it's not physiologic, that's the way it's done. So he also reports in his book that there's this indigenous woman who was riding a horse and she was pregnant, and she got off her horse because they were nomads, so traveling. She got off her horse, gave birth to her baby, got back on the horse, and continued with the group. And so what are we doing with all of this pain? So is this what I'm questioning now really, and I think Deborah Piscali-Bonaro, who's going to speak later about moving from pain to pleasure, is I believe that there's a whole concept about pain that we've totally overdone. We've created a lot of fear, and fear creates anxiety. The emotional state of women will induce pain. So recently, I've had the privilege to write the Canadian guideline for the Society of Obstetricians on the use of non-pharmacologic measures to relieve pain in childbirth. And so for many years, I've put together the evidence that we have on natural means to relieve pain. And I'd like to tell you that in the biology of women, we have what it takes to cope with the sensations of birth. We have two very important resources that are hardwired in our body. The first resource is hormonal, and the second one is neurophysiologic. So these two resources put together are what enable us to give birth. So I often tell the story of, probably you've seen on YouTube, there's this video of two guys who go in and they want to experience what contractions of labor would be like. Mm-hmm. And then you see these guys and they're yelling and they're vomiting and they're having a hard time. And I show this to parents and to even healthcare providers, and I say, well, that's what we think happens in labor, but these men do not have the benefit of the hormones that we have in labor. And these hormones are analgesic, so they're hormones that will relieve the sensations. So when we use the hormones that we have, they're the hormones that are hardwired in our body to create a better pleasurable experience, but also to create attachment, bonding, and breastfeeding. So when I train healthcare providers all over the world, they ignore the hormones in labor, and I think that we really need to get the message out that the hormones are both there as analgesic, but also have other effects for both the mother and the baby. The second resource that we have is neurophysiologic, and our ancestors have known this. And some of us know of this, it's just that we ignore it. So there are 3 mechanisms to relieve pain in general. One mechanism is everything that has to do with control of the mind, the emotions. So that's relaxation, breathing, hypnosis. It's the cognition, so it's what's going on in our head. So if we're feeling anxious, that will increase the nociceptive signals. It will increase pain. If we're feeling calm and zen, it will also decrease pain. So one of our review studies that my colleagues and I have just published, actually we sent it to ACOG to have it in their green journal, and they thought it was too political to publish it, so they didn't. They refused it, even though all of the reviewers thought it was a very good study. 55 randomized controlled trials were included in this study that demonstrated that when women feel safe, they will experience fewer cesareans, fewer instrumental deliveries, have better breastfeeding, better outcomes for the baby. So if you're interested in these studies, I have a little sign-up sheet. You can leave your email and I'll send them to you, also with the guideline. So the second resource that was discovered many thousands of years ago is that if you create a second pain during the first pain that you're experiencing, you'll be releasing the neurotransmitter, the endorphins, that will be reducing the first signal. So how has this been used in the past? In Greece, when people would go into the physician's office and would say, oh, I have this headache, they'd have an aquarium with electrical eels, and they would tell the patient, put your arm in the aquarium. The patient would receive a big electrical discharge, which would create a second pain. And the physician would ask, how's your head now? And they would say, well, you know, my headache is gone. Now I have a sore arm, but the headache is gone. So this is the principle. It's a neurophysiologic principles that we can use in birth just by having a woman put her hand in cold water or by creating pain on acupressure points. Acupuncture activates it in the same sense. The third mechanism is everything that has to do with moving. So women over millions of years or thousands of years, they've known that if they dance, they move with their bodies. So that's the gate control theory. It's a mechanism where you caress the painful area. So moving, dancing, massaging, bathing are all techniques that are involved in this mechanism. So my core message is we are hardwired to give birth. We have everything it takes to manage the sensations of birth. Anxiety and fear will increase the nociceptive signals. Our job is to get the message out that women have what it takes.
So this is wonderful, because this is why we understand that ancient wisdom is so important, because we can transform the way that we're seeing things done in this day and age, because we've always had it. So let's hear now from another wonderful Canadian, Betty Ann, if you'd talk a little bit about your work and what you do.
Well, and maybe about ancient wisdom. I'm here today because I feel like I am working on the basis that we're here to talk about what we really think, not just about our research. And we have our research over there. We've got research on home birth. We've got research on breech birth. And those are the two things I really do want to talk about. But probably in a different way, because for me, there's a lot of important intuitive responses that we have. And one of the things that I've noticed in our own neighborhood, and Julie's not that far from my neighborhood, is that we have a La Leche League. I live like all the old guard midwives live. I have my practice still in my home, and the La Leche League is also in my house, and we have La Leche League meetings while Ken and I are traveling around the world. They still come, and they come into our house. If any of you have seen Michael Moore's films, we don't lock our houses. And so the La Leche League comes, and what they've said to me is, but Ian, when we were first having, you're having a hard time hearing me? There you go. When we were first, she's so like that. When we were first having our meetings outside of she said, the legislator said, when we're having meetings in the community center, people were not talking to each other as much as when they started meeting in your house, and there's something going on here. And I said, you had a home birth, you know what that's about. When women get together in a house, when women are in a house, something happens to them, they can open up, they can think differently, they can think on an intuitive level, they can think about their sexuality, they don't mind breastfeeding a baby while there's another mother sitting right beside them. It's an incredible response that they have. And it's so indicative of home birth that is what occurs, and that's what can happen to them during a home birth. So when Sandra talks about the wisdom of the elders, and when we talk about learning birth from other societies, you have to realize and understand that if we start to lose home birth, we're going to start to lose the reference point on which we base normal. And it is so clear to me from having worked with the midwives, but also the women in Central America, where I learned birth from, that women in hut where they figured out how to throw a hemp rope over their beam in their cornstalk house have come to the point where they feel very comfortable and very safe in their own environment. And when we talk in our home birth studies that are spread all over these tables, and we talk about the fact that safety is very critical for ACOG, safety is very critical for all of us, we sometimes forget that that safety really rests in a place where the woman feels safe, not necessarily where the practitioner thinks she should have the baby. And that is such an important aspect, and very practical aspect of the work that I do. So that when I actually went from Guatemala and decided that I was going to work among the African American women in Alabama, I found that it was a horrific thing to see that the Alabama black granny midwives were having their licenses removed. And that was happening at a time when I realized that the women I was working with there really needed to have the same feeling of safety. And so when I went from there to the north, back up to Canada, and started to work among the Inuit, and the Inuit were expressing the same thing to me. They were saying, you know, they're not allowing us to have babies up here anymore. This is in Nunavik in northern Quebec. And they said, we don't know what to do. Is there anything you think we can do? And they came to me because why? They trusted me because I learned from traditional midwives in Guatemala. They didn't come to me because I had learned in some prestigious organization or ivory institution. And that to them was very critical. For me, one of the problems right now that's happening in Canada is, not in Canada actually, in the United States, sorry, but I'm watching what's happening with ACOG. Julie just mentioned an article that can't be published in ACOG. Ken and I tried to get a home birth article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was turned down because they said that their readers were not interested in what we had to say. Of course, why would physicians have any interest in what could change public health in a major way, home birth? But I felt that we really need to have some changes. So when we went up north and we started working with the women there, we started realizing that we really can change things. We really can change the model of birth in the way it's delivered. And we now have a system where I, in Canada, as a midwife, am required by my province to do births in women's homes. And I'm also required to do births in hospital because the understanding in Canada is you should really go where the woman feels safe. And you should really go and be in the environment in which she feels most comfortable. And at this point, with all the research we have, we are now recommending with our organization, which is the Canadian Association of Midwives, that all women who want a normal birth have a recommendation that they have that birth at home. We've actually stipulated that. And for me, I take it a little farther because I feel that what's happening here is not only is it important that they understand that that's very important for them, but that it is actually a protection against the abnormal birth. And that's really critical for us. I'm going to move really quickly to breech birth because something that has also happened in our country, which I'm very proud of actually, is we've had a transition. One of the transition is just even among our Indigenous people, which is a transition from a very scary, very fearful stand that has been exposed through something we call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which has revealed that more than 6,000 Indigenous people were abused sexually, mentally, and physically by people who were considered their protectors. And these were the nuns, the priests, the people in positions of power, but also in positions of trust. And we had a series of meetings in Canada that has changed my life and has really changed the life of many of the Canadians. And as these meetings were continuing and people were starting to realize that these survivors of residential schools, these survivors who were not allowed to call themselves survivors, who had to say that they were just former residential school students, were allowed to come and tell their stories. And when they were allowed to do that, things started to change in Canada. I really believe that. In Canada, what has happened is even as this commission was occurring, a sacred fire was starting on Victoria Island in the center of Canada, in Ottawa. And as the survivors were telling their stories, and as we were sitting as settlers, as white settlers, listening to them, as we were sitting with Indigenous elders listening to these stories, they were passing little paper bags around so that we could put the Kleenexes from our tears into these bags. It almost brings me to tears right now to think about it. And these little bags were then added to the sacred fire because it's the tears of our nation, desperate to change things. And I'm so happy to be here today to say that I really think things are changing. I really do believe in our country things are changing because of the strength of the survivors to talk about what happened to them. We are talking about trauma today. We definitely need to talk about trauma. And the trauma that we need to talk about is the trauma of many generations of survivors, many generations of women who have had to go through terrible trauma in order to do just what is normal for us. So I'll just take 2 more minutes. So one of the things that's happened in Canada is we have a rematriation of birth in our country. We have a rematriation in Nunavik of birth so that women who were separated from their mothers to go to residential schools are also now being able to be rematriated. Those women who had to leave their settlements in order to give birth, those babies that had to leave settlements in order to give birth, they no longer have to do that. In Nunavik, we no longer do that to women because our Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the midwives and everybody in the country has realized that those women deserve to stay in their own land so that they can continue having their own land claims and continue to have their own births in a safe manner. So I'm really fast going to tell you, breech birth, this is probably the best way to do it, and I learned this from a traditional midwife. We learned it upright. We learned that the best way for this to happen is to come down this way, and it is really so important for us not to rob women at the time of birth of their way of giving birth, because this is one of the biological things that occurs here, is that the umbilical cord is not. Oh, sorry. As the baby's coming down and you're having a breech birth, this umbilical cord is very severely pinched if you're on your back, and that's what occurs when you're on the back. And usually, what they're doing is the baby's coming out this way. So what I'm starting to study now is the importance of upright birth. We have an article coming up, we hope very soon, with Figo. But the importance of the work we're doing right now has to do also with making sure that people understand that some of the original forceps deliveries that were done were invented by, the first one was William Smellie, who in 1770 suggested that we need to have 2 forceps to go up and get the baby. And I've realized that with my hand, I can go up and get the baby because it fits right there, because I'm a woman. And I can grab the baby's head like this and go like this. It's an incredible revelation. I just figured it out actually a few years ago. But those are the revelations that we can have as we go through the process of birth and understand what's really going on and the real ancient wisdom of our elders, the ancient wisdom that we are losing. And we could really lose if we lose home birth.
Thank you, Betty Ann. That's so important for all of us to realize that we're here starting this revolution. And you spell that, turn it around. It's REVOL, and that spells love. So it's a love revolution. We need to be actively engaged in working to preserve this ancient wisdom of all these different cultures. And there's somebody here on this group, 2 people actually, the last 2 speakers, that are going to talk to you about some of the ways that they are changing things and what they saw and how they put it all together and are working to make the change. So we're going to hear from Raylene Phillips. Raylene Phillips is a physician. She's a neonatologist, and she did a great deal to change her whole university hospital. So go ahead and talk.
I should qualify the fact that I'm a neonatologist by telling you that I was a mother first and was a stay-at-home mom until my children were teenagers, and then I went to medical school. And I think having gone to medical school after raising my children gave me a completely different perspective than I would have had I gone to medical school before my children were grown. So I like to say I've been a mother a lot longer than I've been a physician, and very proud of that. I think it's the most important work any woman could do. So I don't need to tell you in this audience the fact that how a baby is welcomed into the world matters, but in many of the audiences that I speak at, because I primarily speak with hospital groups that are trying to make a change in their hospital. And so although the people that invite me to speak, they know that how a baby is welcomed into the world matters. There are many that they bring along that maybe have never really thought about it that way. What we in this room know, and what I try to give evidence for, is that healthy newborns belong with their mothers, and actually even sick newborns belong with their mothers. But it's easier for people to accept at first that all healthy babies, at least, belong with their mothers immediately after birth. Being skin to skin with a mom immediately after birth helps the baby to transition from being inside the womb to outside in ways that are very measurable. We know that it helps them to be more physiologically stable. They can breathe better. They're warmer. They have better heart rates and blood pressure and glucose levels. And they have much less stress. They cry much less if they're skin to skin. This is because mother's chest is where the newborn feels most safe and secure. We've talked a lot about safety of the mother in preparing for this birth and the labor process, but we have to think about the baby. What is birth like from the baby's perspective? The baby feels most safe and secure when they're skin to skin with mother immediately after birth, and babies' instinctive feeding behaviors are activated when they're skin to skin. And all by themselves, they can find the breast. Now, when I was training to be a lactation consultant, I used to wonder why puppies and kittens never needed the lactation consultant. Because they're always skin to skin or fur to fur, And so their instincts are activated and they go and find the breast. And human babies do the same thing if they're in the right place, which is skin to skin with mom. Being skin to skin activates these instincts in a way that are not activated when they're outside of their natural habitat, which is mother's chest. Traveling through mother's birth canal in a vaginal birth introduces the babies to microorganisms of the mother, and being skin to skin further colonizes the baby so that the baby develops the microbiome that helps to set up a healthy immune system. And we've been learning more and more about how critical that healthy microbiome is in long-term health. The baby's first breastfeeding in the first hour or two after birth actually activates specific receptors in the baby's stomach that are for the lactobacillus and the other friendly bacteria. And without the oligosaccharides in mother's milk, they never get activated. And so those receptors are not there, and any organism in the environment can establish residence. So we know that the first breastfeeding, the first skin-to-skin contact, and the first passage through the birth canal is very important for our long-term health. Skin-to-skin contact also leads to a release of multiple hormones that literally change a mother's brain in ways that we can see on functional MRI. That helps to turn on bonding feelings and caregiving behaviors. And this is nature's way of making sure that the mother's preoccupied with taking care of the baby, and so that the baby will survive and thrive. Attachment is no accident. So it's just really important for survival. Now, bonding is a term that we use to refer to a mother's connection to her baby, and attachment is the baby's connection with the mother. And both begin well before birth. Mother and baby are so connected that before birth, they're literally a single biological organism. And when the cord is cut, they still functionally are a psychobiological organism, a single psychobiological organism, even though they're two individuals. And they need each other. They need to stay together because the baby in particular is very dependent on the mother, but the mother is also dependent on the baby for ways that activate her to be better prepared to care for the baby. Now, after birth, the mother's chest and the mother's breasts provide everything that the uterus and the placenta had provided before birth. And that's warmth and protection and nutrition, support for oxygenation, and also love. And any separation from mother after birth induces high levels of stress in the newborn, and they have both short and long-term consequences. We know that mother helps the baby to remain calm when mild stress occurs, and in this way, she's really the baby's first regulator. That interaction that mothers and babies have when babies get stressed and mothers calm them down, this has actually been shown to help develop synaptic connections in the brain that form functional brain circuits that lead to the babies to learn eventually self-regulation. So babies are not really designed to do this when they're first born by themselves. If babies don't get this sensitive and consistent mother-baby interaction, they may never develop optimal self-regulation. And we've all seen evidence of that. When many other mammals are born, their brains are about 80% of their full adult size. And that's why baby monkeys, for example, can hang onto moms and swing through the trees, because they have relatively mature brains. Human babies are born with brains only about 25% adult size. That's why we're so helpless at birth. We're very neurologically immature, and it requires at least 9 more months or more to become more neurologically mature and be a little bit more independent, be able to get up and walk around. Now, optimal brain development during this time requires very close connection and physical contact and caring by the mother or a primary caregiver. We are learning more and more about how skin-to-skin contact is really important for brain development. There's an area of the brain called the amygdala, which has to do with our stress reactions and also with emotional learning and memory modulation. And it's known that skin-to-skin contact directly activates the amygdala and helps it to mature. And that the amygdala is in a critical period of development in the first 2 months after birth, 2 or 3 or 4 months after birth. And so the more skin-to-skin contact, the more that part of the brain is going to be mature and able to handle stress. Dr. Prescott found that in primitive cultures, the ones that held their babies for most of the first year, those were the most peaceful cultures. And the cultures that didn't hold their babies much, They were the more violent cultures later on in life. And his theory was that when babies have skin-to-skin contact or close contact, their brains are flooded with all of the pleasure hormones like oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, things that are really conducive to brain growth in a peaceful way. Whereas when they're stressed, when they're separated, then their brains are flooded with cortisol, which is really like brain poison. It's good for short term, but it really slows down brain development. The brain cannot grow in a time of stress. So when babies are separated from mother or father, they feel very, very unsafe. And their first instinctive response is to protest with loud cries and intense activity. And this is true for all mammals. If you've been around the birth of puppies and kittens, you know that's true for them too. So it's not because a baby is spoiled or being manipulative that they cry and become very activated when they are put down. It's their instinct to survive. It's very dangerous from a evolutionary perspective, an instinctive perspective, to be away from their source of warmth and nutrition and safety. I mean, they could freeze, they could starve, they could be eaten by a predator if they're anywhere else. If separation continues, they go into their second phase of response, which is despair. And it's called despair, but it's really just another instinctive response, like the fawn in the forest who holds very still and quiet. And that's their way of being sure that no predator will find them. It helps them to conserve energy. And we know that now that when babies stop crying after a prolonged separation, that it's not because they're now okay with it. They've not now been trained to sleep through the night. This is because this is just an instinctive response for survival. And their stress levels still remain high, and their brain level development slows. And their trust in their parents and in the world is decreased, and over time it can actually be destroyed. Now, protest in small amounts is not harmful to the developing brain, but despair is harmful. Now, hospital practices that separate babies and mothers cause harm. Sometimes separation we know is necessary, and believe me, as a neonatologist, I know this to be true, because sometimes the mother or the baby are medically unstable, but even then it still causes harm, whether it's acknowledged or not. And it will need to be healed at some time in the future. And this is possible if it is recognized and if help is available. But like you said, Dave, an ounce of prevention is worth tons and tons of cure. However, unnecessary separation of mothers and babies should never, ever happen. And because routine separation for the convenience of hospital staff has gone on for so long, at least in our recent memory, it is often viewed as normal and harmless. But nothing could be further from the truth. Healthcare providers and mothers and fathers must be made aware of how important it is to keep babies with their mothers after birth. Dr. Bergman has coined the term zero separation and has challenged caregivers everywhere to make it our goal to have zero separation of all newborns with their mothers. We know that transitions are important in birth. Our entrance into the world is the first major transition. There's so much going on that I've just described in the first hour after birth that in our hospital we've decided to call it the sacred hour. Because sacred means something that is highly important and deserving of respect. And the first hour after birth is one of those times and deserves to be honored and protected whenever possible. So we know that no one would interrupt a wedding or routine business, so why would we interrupt this special time for our routine business? Well, while every baby's entire first year is very important, it's the first hour after birth when trust and connection are first experienced outside the womb. And we must not cavalierly rob mothers and babies of this experience, unless it's for a very good reason. Instead, we must honor and protect and cherish that special time together. And that's my mission and why I'm here.
Thank you. So one of the other special people on this panel is Kathy Kendall Taggett, and she's here to explain a lot more to you about how education and how maternal issues are important. So Kathy?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me here today. And just give you a little bit of idea about my background. I've actually trained as a developmental psychologist and switched. Sorry, good. and switched to health psychology about 15 years ago. But I started actually as a family violence researcher. I started working for a rape crisis center back in 1983, so I've been in that field for a very, very, very long time. And you know, that trauma perspective informs a lot of my work. And then, you know, I became a mother and like struggled through a really difficult birth experience and a lot of depression, and did what I was kind of trained to do to kind of cope with it. I ended up writing a book about it. And it's now in its 4th edition, but back in 1992 when I wrote that, you couldn't even talk about trauma from birth, because the definition, you know, the exposure criteria, what we talk about, was, you know, it had to be beyond or outside the realm of normal human experience. And obviously birth did not fit that. Now they've changed the definition, so we actually can use the PTSD diagnosis. But that actually was, you know, that work, you know, again, I said, you know, pretty heavy stuff, looking at sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and then postpartum depression. So my breastfeeding work began as a Legislative leader, and that was my happy counterpart to the other stuff that I was doing. But I found over the years that they started melding. I started getting asked to speak, you know, about, you know, looking at breastfeeding and postpartum depression, and looking at women who were survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault and how that impacted their breastfeeding experience. I ended up talking to women, you know, all over the country about it. And oftentimes, I was the first person they'd ever told. You know, not even their husband or their partner knew. You know, and that's a heartbreaking thing. And often, many times, especially within Legislative circles, everybody sort of had this idea that everybody else was this ideal family. And I had so many women leaders who would come up and say, "I'm sure I'm the only one." And as I kept hearing that at pretty much every conference I went, you know, I started assuring women, no, you definitely are not the only one. I talked to hundreds of women over the years with postpartum depression, and I found out why. Because every time that a woman would call the Legislative hotline for the whole country, if they said they had depression, they were giving out my home telephone number. So even though I was trained as a researcher, I was, you know, it put me in contact with so many women, and I was just determined to kind of tell their story. Well, it's interesting that Betty Ann talked about the residential schools, because what I want to talk a little bit about is the role of breastfeeding and resiliency. So given that kind of like, you know, really powerful kind of experiences, you know, negative experiences that women have, can breastfeeding actually make any difference? And it was a young colleague of mine named Cami Goldhammer, and she is an American Indian in Washington State. And she was talking about, we had a big summit, you know, about 2 years ago at the Lactation Consultant Conference. And she was talking about how, you know, like the history of residential schools in the United States, you know, has disrupted, you know, like for 7 generations. And she says, and it takes that long to kind of heal. And she felt like that breastfeeding was a way to sort of take back and heal that fracture that happened in the family because of removing these children from their homes, you know, and how this has been a generational thing. And she called it food sovereignty. And she actually said, she used a phrase in this talk, and she said that breastfeeding makes all the difference. So I started thinking about that, and I started kind of thinking, okay, how can we look at what we know in kind of a little different framework? You know, one of the things that kind of first kind of caught my eye is, some of you probably remember in 2013, CDC issued a report. And for the first time in a decade, the gap, you know, between white and black infants in terms of mortality had dropped significantly. It went from 13.8 per thousand to 12.4 per thousand. Now, we've still got a ways to go, but that's a really, really encouraging thing. And the thing that made the difference was that, you know, and this is what the CDC actually acknowledged, that it was the breastfeeding that's growing up within the grassroots organizations within the African American community, that had actually significantly dropped that. So, you know, thinking about what Cami Goldhammer said and thinking about this, you know, I started looking kind of at the literature kind of in a different kind of way. Well, we did a big study, and we're actually still working on the data from it, but we collected data from 6,410 moms. We were actually looking initially at just mother-infant sleep. You know, where are babies sleeping, where are mothers saying that the babies are sleeping, which is often very, very different from where they are actually sleeping. We found actually when we asked the question, where do your babies end the night? You know, instead of being like 30% saying that babies were in the bed, all of a sudden it went to 60%. That's the question you've got to ask. And by the way, our sample in the United States was largely Caucasian, and in previous studies, only about 15% said that they bed share. Well, it's simply not true. They just are better at lying about it. You know? Oh no, we've got to see this crib, it's beautiful, you know, the baby's in there and the baby's out. That's pretty much what happens. Well, so, you know, we looked at like, does breastfeeding make a difference in terms of things like mental health? You know, and what we kind of found is, you know, again, with this large sample of mothers, we were really able to do some interesting analysis, and we found actually exclusive breastfeeding is a very different animal than mixed feeding from a physiological standpoint. And we know from like a whole body of research in psychoneuroimmunology that breastfeeding actually down-regulates or turns off that stress response. You know, and so again, thinking about kind of like long-term for the effects for the mother, what happens when that stress response is turned off over and over and over again? You know, and so we've, you know, again, that it has to do with that sort of, you know, for breastfeeding to be successful, there has to be that responsivity and care. You know, and I think the other thing that does is it creates that secure attachment. And we start seeing these kind of long-term effects. But what happens, you know, when a woman has a history of sexual assault? Well, again, we had this huge sample. We had 994 women who identified as having been sexually assaulted. Now, we had 25% of that total sample said they had experienced contact child sexual abuse. Okay, that's exactly right in line with the literature. But looking at the more serious part of that, this, you know, actual sexual assault, you know, where there was actually, I mean, we have specific definitions of what that is. It was, you know, again, it was about 13%, but it was 994 women. And so for a perinatal sample, we had really literally the largest sample of women who had that experience. And so we started kind of looking, okay, well, what are the effects of sexual assault? Well, not surprisingly, they were just this incredible pervasive negative effect. You know, it impacted sleep, it impacted depression, anxiety, anger and irritability, all these things. You know, it looked like a pretty bleak picture. And one day I'm actually on a plane, and I was kind of sitting there noodling around with my data. And I thought, well, you know, we've seen that breastfeeding, especially exclusive breastfeeding, has all this great effect. And we've seen that sexual assault has all this pervasive, you know, negative effect. What happens if we put those two together? Does it make any difference? And so I started just kind of running the numbers, and it's like I'm looking at the numbers, and the numbers didn't jump out to me, but the graphs did. Because what I saw was this. You know, when you looked at, you know, like any of the effects, and it was really interesting because on every variable we looked at, it was the same thing. You could see, you know, like here, these are the exclusively breastfeeding moms. They were kind of like here, and you know, on most of the things, there was definitely still an effect of sexual assault. But mixed and formula feeding we put together because we found on previous analysis that they were, you know, there was no significant difference. It looked like this. And what we interpreted this to mean is that we were really seeing that breastfeeding was in fact lessening the impact of the traumatic event. And I just thought that was just, I mean, it was jaw-dropping when I saw it, and it was so consistent. And I thought, wow, isn't that a wonderful thing? And what a brilliant system that Mother Nature does not expect that women are going to come into being parents having no, you know, like bad things having happened to them. But what breastfeeding allowed them to do is start fresh. And I thought, wow, that is, I mean, that's just incredible. And the more I think about that, and it's like, this is something we tell the families all the time, is it's like, this intergenerational cycle of abuse and stuff that you may have in this background stops with you. You have the opportunity to have this stop with you. You know, and what we see too is like Blaine Strathern is a researcher from Australia, and he did a 15-year longitudinal study, 7,000 families. They looked at maternal perpetrated child maltreatment. So it was substantiated cases. They had about 500. What they found was that if mothers breastfed for at least 4 months, it dropped the rate of maternal perpetrated child maltreatment or child neglect by 3.8 times and physical abuse by 2.6 times. And you know, I met Lane because we were in Germany together at a conference, and I was telling him, I said, you know, I've got something to show you because I think I know why. One of the things that was really striking with when we looked at that, you know, sexual assault and breastfeeding data was when you looked at anger and irritability. You know, and it's like we asked moms to rate how often they were angry and irritable. You know, and well, most moms are angry and irritable at least some of the time. But what we kind of found was that if you were exclusively breastfeeding, even if you had a history of sexual assault, it was exactly the same between the assaulted and the non-assaulted moms. But if you were mixed or formula feeding, it looked like this. There was a spike up. And that's so consistent with what we see in post-traumatic stress disorder. Oftentimes people, when they talk about, like, say, parents who maybe had PTSD coming back from like a war zone, they'd be sitting there disengaged and then suddenly fly into a rage. There was breastfeeding provided a physiological way to turn that off. And I think that that's just an incredible thing. Now, we have to recognize that for women with a history of sexual assault, though, it isn't always easy, and it isn't always even pleasant, but there's physiological benefit from it that, again, allows there to be sort of a do-over, like, this is going to stop here, and we're going to go in this direction. And it's like, I was talking one time at a WIC conference in Texas, and I was saying about how sometimes women who've had this, the experience of sexual assault found that breastfeeding their baby, this is what they were telling me, had been very, very healing and in fact turned their life in a different direction. And I met a young woman there and she said, that's so true for me. And she was telling me about how she had been the daughter of a prostitute and was raped for the first time at the age of 3. And went through her life and had this just incredible history of sexual assault. It was unbelievable what this young woman had been through. And she said, when I was able to breastfeed my baby, she said, I was going down such a bad road, and then I got pregnant, and then I had this baby and breastfed this baby. And she said, she said, what you described that's what happened. My life was going this way, and then it suddenly went this way. And she said she was a peer counselor now. She was a peer counselor and actually now works with other women who have similar kind of circumstances. Now, again, I'm not Pollyanna to say that, just we'll do it and it's going to solve all the world's problems. But I think we have some evidence to say, that this is one of the ways that there's a resiliency built in, and, we've got to, throw everything we can toward working to help moms accomplish that and do that. And again, that goes back to, like, looking at things like birth. What are the things that interfere with that? How can we address that? And can this make a difference for the next 7 generations? And I absolutely believe it can.
Thank you, Kathy, very much.
Yeah.
So I'd like to turn the time over, just a brief amount of time over to Dave. And then we'll open it up for you all to ask a few questions as well. Okay.
I just wanted to wrap up that we're talking about ancient wisdom and the inherent knowledge that women have, the intuitive knowledge that women have. And the big point about all that, it is generally not respected by the obstetric industry. The 12,000 people in town are drawing more on their education rather than their awareness of this. So we're offering a contrast in something like that. But I love hearing about the sacred hour. I think about the nursery. I always think if I could find the guy who invented it, and I know it's a guy, I'd say, come up and say, what were you thinking about, when you came up with the idea of a nursery? So we have 10 minutes.
So
If anybody
has any questions of the
Question?
panel,
Yeah.
please feel free to ask. Yes.
Could you stand up and tell us a little?
I get to run around the mic as well. Here you go. I'll hold it for you. Okay, aloha, my name is Janice. I live in California, but I've spent 3 decades in Hawaii, so it still hangs on. Dave, I was born in 1949 as well.
Okay.
My mother was put under with gas, probably delivered with forceps, no doubt hung by my heels, and welcome to the world slapped. And
How do you feel about that?
I don't like it. And I have this theory, because I'm a dinosaur breastfeeding teacher, that the response that our generation had in the late 60s, early 70s, where we had to touch a lot, remember those days, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, was because we hadn't been touched as babies. I know my father held me skin to skin, because I have pictures of us at the beach. He's in a suit and I'm in a diaper, but I probably never was held skin to skin by my mother. And people go, that's not why everybody went crazy in the 60s and 70s. Why not?
Big part
We
of
were
it.
not touched.
Thank you for that point.
That's a good point. Thank you so much. Kate,
Any other hippies in here?
Kate has a question. Kate has something.
Hi, I'm Kate White. I'm Director of Education with APA. And thank you all panelists very much. I'm so curious about each one of you. I have questions for everyone, but just right now I want to ask Kathleen Kendall Tackett, can we have access to those studies you're talking about, the ones that you're working on with the 6,400 women? And
One article that you might find, because you can find this freely online, I mean, and I'm happy to send the original article on the sexual abuse along, but I kind of did a synthesis for La Leche League for Breastfeeding Today. So if you go on, it's breastfeedingtoday.org. It's all there, and it's got little video clips even in it, and some links to different, and it's got the slides where you can actually see the data. So that would be a good place. But if you want to give me your email address, I'm happy to actually send it to you too. Yes.
That's
Yes.
true for all the panelists. They can give you a card, you can give them your card, and they all are going to have lists where you can sign up to get email from them.
And I have my business cards over there on that table with some of the cards from the books that we publish and stuff, so you can get a hold of me through there. So I've got a little stack of business cards over there, so please help yourself.
We have time for one more question.
We
I
have
saw
a question
somebody
right over
else's
here.
hand.
I'm standing right here.
Oh, good, okay.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Claudia Booker, and I'm older than you, and I'm older than you. I was born in 1948. November, I just made it in that year. But the birth experience that you're talking about of ether and the things that happened to you when you were born is not necessarily the birth experience that African American women went through at that time in America. I was born here. I'm a native Washingtonian, will live and die in this plantation. And our women were not offered pain medication of any kind at that time. None. I was born at Freedman's Hospital, the second African-American hospital in the United States. Women had babies in wards, 6, 10, 12 women in a ward, separated by a curtain. You birthed alone. No one from your family, no friends, no one was allowed to be there. You laid in a bed with sheets between you, with one light in the middle of the floor, and you birthed your baby. They came in periodically and took a peek up the canal and put the cover back down and came back when you were making noises of pushing, lying on your back. So for us who were born of that generation, our issues of isolation, detachment with our mothers with their babies, we had the same experiences where you were taken right away. You often didn't get your baby back for several days. At least 3 days your baby was gone before you saw a baby and you hoped to God it was yours, but you weren't really guaranteed that it was your baby that was coming back to you. And breastfeeding was not allowed at that time. So our versions of how, for many of us, we started off our lives, and the lack of foundational bonding between mothers and their children is dramatic in a different way than the stories that you shared.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So, just to end our panel, I would like to just let you know that around the room on the tables, please make certain that you check in on some of those issues. The Association for Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health is also here to help you in any way to make contact, because we do need to be, and the National Perinatal Association and many of the other wonderful associations, IMBCO, several of them are here because this is a coalition that Birth Keepers is doing for us that is so wonderful, because we need to get this message out there. So thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to us.